Hello students. So today also we are moving on with the same chapter, that is sexual reproduction in flowering plants. Now in the previous sessions we had started to study about structure of a bisexual flower. We studied about all the parts of a bisexual flower and male and female reproductive structure, that is we studied androecium first, okay, and how the pollen grains are produced. Then we studied about gynoecium. We studied the structure of ovule and structure of a female gametophyte. Okay, so all that we finished with androecium and gynoecium. So male gametes and female gametes is the whole structure we finished with. Now we are moving on to study about one of the important event which takes place during sexual reproduction, that is pollination. Okay, so pollination is a very important event which takes place during sexual reproduction. So now you know that male gametes are present in the pollen grains. Female gamete is present inside the embryo sac, and male and female gametes in flowering plants, they are non-motile. Okay, since both the gametes are non-motile, there should be some agent, or these gametes have to be brought together for fertilization. Okay, so if fertilization has to take place, male gamete and female gamete has to be brought together, and this is achieved by pollination. So we'll see exactly what do we mean by pollination. So pollination means it is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma. So that transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma, we call it as pollination. Okay, so this can be a 1-mark question. A definition can be asked, what is pollination? So pollination is transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma. So this is called pollination. So for achieving this pollination, plants have to depend on some external agents. Okay, so those external agents, so about that we will study further. Okay, so now I told you what is pollination. That is, when we study the source of pollen grains, we see that pollination can be classified into 3 types. Okay, so based on the source of pollen grains, we are classifying the whole process of pollination into 3 types. Okay, so kinds of pollination. It is first one, autogamy. Okay, so I told you it is depending on the source of pollen grains. We are doing this classification. Now what is this autogamy? Autogamy is nothing but transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same flower. Okay, so transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same flower. So here in autogamy there is only one flower involved. Okay, so here what happens, pollen grains, okay, so they are transferred from the anther to the stigma. Okay, so this is within the same flower. Okay, so this is called autogamy. So you know that a flower, a bisexual flower, will have both male reproductive structure and female reproductive structure. So in a bisexual flower, we know that autogamy can occur. So this is complete self-pollination. So one flower, within that anther will be releasing the pollen grains, and stigma will, that is the pollen grains will land over the stigma of the same flower. So here only one flower is involved. This is called autogamy. Okay. Now, I told you this is happening in a bisexual flower. And many of the plants are producing bisexual flower. But if autogamy has to happen in a bisexual flower, there are like some criteria. Just because the flower is bisexual, we can't say that autogamy is happening in the flower. No, because there are some criteria. Like for example, if autogamy has to happen in a bisexual flower, there should be synchrony in pollen grain release and stigma receptivity. Now, to say this thing in simple words, we can say there should be, that is, maturation of androecium, maturation of gynoecium should take place at the same time. If it is happening, then we can think of, that is, autogamy can happen. Now, you just imagine, even though it's a bisexual flower, androecium is maturing first, releasing the pollen grains, but at the same time we see gynoecium is still immature, okay, or the vice versa. If that is the case, autogamy cannot happen. So, in a bisexual flower, if autogamy has to happen, there should be, that is, androecium and gynoecium should mature at the same time. That is one thing. Another thing is androecium and gynoecium, okay, that is the stamens and the carpels, they have to be placed closer to each other. There shouldn't be any barriers, there shouldn't be any difference in their position. Okay, so they should be closer to each other. Only then we will see that even in a bisexual flower, okay, we can see autogamy. Okay. So, in some plants, okay, so in some plants, for example, oxalis, okay, so oxalis, okay, so viola. So, in example, in these plants, we see that it produces two types of flowers. Both are bisexual, but we see that there are two types of flowers. So, we will see what are they. Okay, so the first type of flower is called chasmogamous flower, and the other type of flower is called cleistogamous flower. Okay, so these are bisexual flowers only. I'll say you the difference. So it is in some plants, like example I tell you oxalis or viola or even camelina, okay, you will see that it will produce two types of flower. First is chasmogamous flower. So what are these chasmogamous flower? It is the normal bisexual flower, like how we see in other species, same like that, okay, but that is it opens out, it blooms out, that is exposing the anther and stigma, okay. So all that is it's a normal bisexual flower, that is chasmogamous flower. What about this cleistogamous flower? On the same plant, it will produce another flower which is called cleistogamous, which do not open at all, okay, it doesn't bloom out, it is like a bud, okay, so it never opens. So within this flower there is androecium, there is gynoecium, okay. Now what happens in a cleistogamous flower, since anther and carpel they're like closer to each other, okay, and pollen grain, that is when anthers dehisce, pollen grains will be released, immediately it falls on the stigma and brings about fertilization, okay. So that is cleistogamous flower, okay. So both the type of flowers are produced on the same plant. Now the advantage of this cleistogamous flower is, since it is closed, actually it never opens at all, okay, so it is a complete autogamy. No pollen grains from any other flower has a chance to fall on the stigma, okay, so it's a complete autogamy. That is one thing. Another thing is, in case even if there are no pollinators, that is the agents which will bring about pollination, even in their absence also, here in cleistogamous flower, it is that is the seed set, fruit formation, fertilization, all that is assured, okay. So it is for sure that within the cleistogamous flower, okay, fertilization will happen, okay, fruit formation will happen and seed formation will happen, okay. So that's the advantage of cleistogamous flower, okay. So about these flowers. Okay, maybe for 2 marks you may get a question, what are casmogamous flower and what are cleistogamous flower. Okay, so then you need to say that in some plants you need to give the examples and say what is casmogamous flower and cleistogamous flower. Okay, so this is about the first type of pollination what we studied, that is autogamy, where that is a complete self-pollination. Pollen grains from the anther to the stigma, the transfer will happen within the same flower. So in autogamy, remember that there is only one flower involved. So now the second type of pollination which we are going to study is geitonogamy. Okay, so here what happens is pollen grains are released from the anther. Okay, so transfer of pollen grains from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower. So here 2 flowers are involved. Okay, so from one flower anther is transferred to the stigma of another flower, but both the flowers are on the same plant. Okay, so both the flowers are on the same plant, so they are the product of the same plant. So here what we say is, even though this type of pollination, functionally it is cross pollination because 2 flowers are involved. Pollen grains from the anther of one flower is being transferred to the stigma of another flower. So we say functionally it is cross pollination, but genetically we say it is self pollination. Why do we say that? Because both the flowers, okay, which are involved in pollination, they are on the same plant. So since they are on the same plant, genetically both the gametes will be similar. Male gamete and female gamete will be similar because they are the product of the same plant. Okay, so therefore geitonogamy is transfer of pollen grains from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower, but on the same plant. Okay, so that is geitonogamy. Now coming to the next type, third type, that is xenogamy. Now xenogamy, we say it is complete cross pollination. So why do we say that? We'll just see what happens here. So in xenogamy, pollens are transferred from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower, but both the flowers are on different plants. Okay, so here also 2 flowers are involved, but both the flowers are on 2 different plants. Therefore we say this is a complete cross pollination because male and female gametes are genetically different. Okay, so that is xenogamy. So we say xenogamy is the only one complete cross pollination. Okay, so these are the 3 types of pollination depending on the source of pollen. Now this can be a 3 marks question. Okay, so 3 marks question where you can get a question that is explain the different types of pollination. Then you need to remember these terms: autogamy, okay, geitonogamy and xenogamy. Okay, so remember that autogamy, it is one flower involved, transfer of pollen to the stigma happens. Geitonogamy, 2 flowers are involved, transfer of pollen grains from anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower, but on the same plant. Here also 2 flowers are involved, but they are on 2 different plants. Okay, so you need to explain all the 3. These terms you need to write, and also you have to explain what it is. Okay, so that is about different types of pollination. Now, after we studied about what is pollination, you know now what are the different types of pollination. So initially in the beginning of the session I told you, since pollen grains and the female gamete both are non-motile, okay, they cannot move on their own, they have to depend. Now when we say transfer of pollen grains are not moving on their own. Okay, the plant is depending on some external agent for pollination. So that we are going to study now, that is agents of pollination. Okay, so next we'll move on to study about agents of pollination. Okay, so I told you the plants have to depend on some external agents. Now when we say external agents, what are the different types of external agents? We will see. So for pollination, plants depend on two main agents. We say abiotic agents, okay, and biotic agents. So you see this term, you come to know abiotic agents, okay, non-living, biotic agents, living organisms. So the plants are depending on certain agents. Now when we say abiotic, okay, mainly it is wind and water. Okay, so abiotic agents mainly include wind and water. So wind and water are the abiotic agents which bring about pollination. Now what about biotic agents? Biotic agents, it means the living organisms. So mainly animals, different types of animals are involved, okay, in bringing about pollination. Okay, so each one, okay, wind pollination, water pollination, and this one biotic, different animals, how they are involved. So all that we will study one by one. Okay, now when we compare abiotic and biotic, okay, so you should know that flowering plants, okay, mainly it depends on biotic agents. So okay, when we compare this and this, majority of the plants depend on biotic agents. Okay, so less number of plants depend on abiotic agents. Now when we see these two, okay, so wind and water, so plants which are depending on wind and water for pollination, okay, we will see that see the pollen grains moving with the help of wind or water. It's just a matter of chance that they come and fall on the stigma. Okay, so loss of pollen grains is more. So here the plants which depend on wind and water for pollination, we see that they will produce enormous amount of pollen grains. So the number of pollen grains produced will be very high in the plants which depend on wind and water. Okay, so the reason behind it is because the abiotic factors, okay, when they depend on that, the chance of pollens falling on the stigma, the chances are less, and also loss of pollen is more. Okay, so because of that, we see that plants which depend on wind and water, they will produce more number of pollen grains, that is enormous number of pollen grains. Okay, so now what we do is we will study one by one. So the plants which depend on abiotic agents, the plants which depend on biotic agents, okay, so they will have some adaptations. Okay, so to survive in that habitat and to get the help from the animals, or to depend on wind and water. So there are like different adaptations, the characteristic features of each one are there, which we will study one by one. Okay, so now we'll start studying about the different agents of pollination. So I told you there are abiotic agents and biotic agents. So we'll start off with the abiotic agents. So in that, the first one we are going to study is wind pollination. Okay, so I told you there are some plants which depend on wind for transfer of pollen grains, that is for pollination. Okay, so mainly it is grass, okay, so monocots, we see that they depend on wind for pollination. So when a plant depends on wind, there are some, I told you, some adaptations, some changes in the flower. Okay, and these are, you should study that as a characteristic features of wind pollinated flowers. Now this is again a 3 marks question, where the question will be asked, list the characteristic features of wind pollinated flower. Okay, so the plants which depend on wind for pollination make some adaptation, some changes are there in the flower, which we will study one by one. So first thing is, pollen grains which are released should be lightweight and it should be non-sticky. Okay, so because see, wind has to carry the pollen grains, so it has to be lightweight, then it will be easily carried, and also it has to be non-sticky so that it reaches the stigma. Okay, so pollen grains should be light and non-sticky. That is one. Then we see that the anthers are well exposed. Now imagine a flower where the anther has a very small filament and it is deep inside the petal, then you can't think of pollen grains carried away by wind. Okay, so the anthers will be inside the flower covered by petals, right? So that will not happen in wind pollinated flower. So we will see that the anther will be coming out of the flower, that is well exposed. It is coming out of the flower easily to come in contact with the wind, so that pollen grains can be easily carried away. So that is one thing, that is anthers are well exposed. Then we see stigma will be feathery. Okay, so stigma is feathery again to trap the pollen. So these are also like waving in the wind. They are like elongated style where it comes out of the flower, and you know it is like waving with the along with the wind. So the chances of trapping the pollen in the wind becomes what? So because of that, we see that stigma will be feathery. Then there is a single ovule in the ovary. So usually the flowers which depend on wind for pollination, we see there's a single ovule inside the ovary. Here also the reason behind it is multiple pollens coming and falling on the stigma through the wind is a matter of chance. So because of that, we see that there's only single ovule inside the ovary. Okay, and then the flowers, okay, so many flowers they are compactly arranged to form an inflorescence. Usually this is another characteristic feature which we find in wind pollinated flower. So these are the characteristic features of wind pollinated flower which you need to study. Okay, as I told, it can be asked for as a 3 marks question. Okay, then one more thing is the example, all of you have seen the corn cob. Okay, so the tassels which are actually like, you see that it is like waving in the wind, it is nothing but the style and stigma. Okay, so trap the pollen grains, and as I told you, many of the grasses also they depend on wind for pollination. Okay, so that is about the wind pollination. And wind pollination, there's a term used for wind pollination. Okay, so when there is wind pollination, we call it as anemophily. Okay, so anemophily is a term we use for wind pollination. Okay, so that was about wind pollination. Now next we'll move on to water pollination. So many plants depend on water for transfer of pollen grains. Okay, so here I told you that that's majority of the angiosperms, that is flowering plants, will depend on animals only. Okay, so here in water pollination it's like very few, hardly 30 genera. That too, most of them are like monocots which are depending on water for pollination. Okay, so now when we say this one, you just recall your last year's syllabus where we studied about algae, bryophytes and pteridophytes. Now in all these 3 groups of plants, you know that they depend on water for, that's a mode of transport for pollen grains. Okay, and especially in bryophytes and pteridophytes, Okay, we say that because of this limitation that these plants are not well flourished. Okay, so angiosperms are the well flourished plants. These bryophytes and pteridophytes, we don't find them anywhere and everywhere. Okay, the limiting factor is this one, because they require water for pollination. Okay, now coming to this examples. Okay, so some of the example, that is the plants which depend on water for pollination, is Vallisneria and Hydrilla. Okay, that is freshwater. These are the freshwater plants. We have one more example, that is Zostera, which is a marine plant. Okay, so we'll just take these examples and we'll try to see like how pollination happens in these plants. Okay, and all the hydrophytes. So hydrophytes means the plants which are living in water. All the hydrophytes are not depending on water for pollination. So that is one thing you should keep in mind. Okay, because like for example, water hyacinth. Okay, so I told you in the first session about a plant called as water hyacinth. That is scientific name is Eichhornia. Okay, so this plant and water lily. Okay, so these are hydrophytes. They are plants which are living in water, but they don't depend on water for pollination. Okay, these plants, they will produce the flower which is exposed outside. Okay, both, that is Eichhornia, that is water hyacinth and water lily. They expose the flower which is coming out of the water level, and they depend on insects or wind for pollination. So even though these plants are living in water, these are hydrophytes, but they don't depend on water for pollination. So there are like few species of plants which are living in water and which depend on water for pollination. So these are the examples given. Vallisneria and Hydrilla, which is a freshwater plants, okay, and Zostera, which is a marine plant. So I told you about different examples of plants which depend on water for pollination. Okay, so I told about Vallisneria, Hydrilla and Zostera. Okay, so we'll just see, now this is Vallisneria plant, which is a hydrophyte. Okay, it is within the water and it is attached. Okay, now you see these leaves and you can see one coiled structure here. Okay, and this is a female flower. So the stalk of the female flower is coiled. So what happens is when the flower matures, okay, male flowers and female flowers are different. It's not bisexual flower. Okay, so male flowers are just released into water, and female flowers, they are not released. Okay, it is attached to the plant itself by a long coiled stalk. Okay, so when the flower matures, okay, the stalk will like slowly uncoil and the flower will come to the almost to the surface of water. Okay, so this is a female flower. Male flower will be very tiny flower which will be just released from the plant, which will be just moving in water current. Okay, and pollen grains will be released, or the flower itself comes in contact with the female flower with the water current and it brings about pollination. Okay, and in Zostera, okay, Zostera I told you it's a marine grass, it's a marine plant. In that what happens is the female flower, okay, that is also released, and male flower, it releases the pollen grains. Okay, so pollen grains just passively move in the water current and it brings about pollination. Okay, so like maybe for 2 marks you may get a question like how does water pollination happens in Vallisneria and Zostera. Okay, so then you need to just explain like how it goes about with the diagram here. Okay, so these plants are depending on water for pollination. So here what happens, the pollen grains, I told you it is like released in water. One more characteristic feature what we see here is the pollen grains are ribbon shaped. Okay, so the shape of the pollen grain will be ribbon like, and this adaptation is mainly because it has to move passively in the water current. Okay, so we see in other species of plants, the land plants, the pollen grains are almost spherical. Okay, so here in some species which depends on water for pollination, we see that it is ribbon shape, and also pollen grains will have a coating of mucilage. So mucilage coating over this pollen grains is to avoid wetting of the pollen grains. So in water, okay, so to avoid wetting, the pollen grains will be having a coating of mucilage. So this is also like the adaptation we find, okay, to survive in this habitat. Okay, so this is about water pollination. Okay, so now we studied about wind pollination and also about water pollination. So one thing you should keep in mind is the flowers which are depending on wind and water for pollination, they are not brightly colored. Okay, so there will be no colorful petals in these flowers, they will not have fragrance, they will not have nectar. Okay, so all these things are absent in flowers which are depending on wind and water. So why do you think, what is the reason behind it? Okay, so the reason I will say you when I explain the next part, that is animal pollination, that is biotic. Okay, so I told you some of the plants, that is majority of the flowering plants depend on biotic agent for pollination, and I told you it is mainly animals. So when we say animals, it includes varieties of animals. Okay, it may be bees, it may be butterflies, moth. So many animals are helping in pollination. Okay, so the examples I told you, the larger animals also, like some of the primates. Okay, so like lemurs which are living on the tree. Okay, so these animals also we have seen that it brings about, it helps in some, pollination in some species of the plants. Even some of the lizards, okay, some of the rodents, that is arboreal rodents, that is which lives on the trees. Okay, bats, and also some of the birds. So birds, usually the tiny birds like hummingbirds, sunbirds. Okay, so these all these animals, we see that it brings about pollination. Now when we see there's a like wide range of animals which are helping in pollination, out of this mainly it is different types of insects which are the main agent which brings about pollination, and that too in this group of insects mainly it is bees. Okay, so bees are said to be the main pollinating agent. Okay, so with all this, these examples of animals which are bringing about pollination. Now we should know that again, when plants are depending on these animals for pollination, again there will be like some changes, some adaptations made by these plants. Okay, because these animals, when they have to bring in pollination, there should be like some reason for these animals to get attracted towards this plant. Okay, so we see that the plants which are depending on animals for pollination, okay, it is said that the flowers will be very large in size, okay, and the petals will be brightly colored. Okay, so large petals, brightly colored petals, nice fragrance, okay, fragrant flowers, and also nectar which is present inside the flower. Okay, so all these are characters, okay, mainly to attract the pollinators. Okay, so especially the plants which depend on flies and moth. Okay, for pollination, you see that they will secrete a stinky smell. Okay, the odor, okay, that is mainly to attract. So that foul odor will be produced from the flower to attract the flies and moth. Okay, so all other animals like butterflies, bees, so mainly these will be attracted towards the fragrance of the flower, okay, and the color of the flower, okay, and mainly the nectar. Okay, so we say if the plants has to, if the animals have to pollinate, okay, they have to come visit the flower for some reason. Okay, so we say the plant has to give a floral reward. Okay, so what are these floral rewards? I'll say you now. So I told you about the floral rewards. So the plants which are depending on animals for pollination, they have to give some floral rewards for these animals so that the animals get attracted towards the flower, okay, and they help in pollination. Okay, so to sustain this animal entry, the floral rewards which are given by the flower, it is usually pollen grains and nectar. Okay, so majority of the insects which are entering into a flower, they come mainly to get nectar or even to feed on the pollen grains. So here the plants which are depending on animals, okay, the pollen grains will be sticky. That is one of the characteristic feature. Okay, so they are sticky so that the insect is entering into a flower, it is feeding on the nectar, or maybe it is eating the pollen grains. So meanwhile what happens, the pollen grains stick onto the body of the insect. Now this insect is moving to another flower. Okay, so when that is happening, it is bringing about pollination. So these are the main two floral rewards. Okay, and I told you the characteristic feature of the flower which depends on animal for pollination. Okay, so the petals are brightly colored. Okay, the flowers will have lot of fragrance. Okay, they produce lot of nectar. Okay, so these are the characteristic features. So now these floral rewards, it's not only pollen grains and nectar. In some species we will see the floral, that is the floral reward can be the space providing, okay, the space provided for the insects to lay eggs. Okay, so that we see in the largest flower. Okay, so the largest flower, Amorphophilus, the flower itself is almost 6 feet. Okay, they are providing space within the ovary for the insects to lay eggs. The similar relationship we do find even between the plant called yucca and a moth. Okay, so there is a relationship between this plant named yucca and the moth, where both of them cannot complete their life cycle without each other. So what is happening here is yucca, okay, it is producing the flower, providing space for the moth to enter and lay eggs within the locule of the ovary. So you know, locule is the space or cavity which you find inside the ovary. So that space is given for this moth to come and lay eggs. So as it is doing that work, it is bringing about pollination also. Okay, and the eggs which are laid, it will be hatched, and you will see that mainly it is by the time of seed setting. Okay, so you will see that the flies will be developed there. Okay, so this is a relationship. So the floral reward here is not pollen grain and nectar, but it is the space providing for the insects to come and lay eggs. Okay, so these are the few points which you need to remember about animal pollination. Okay, so there is like one more thing, that some of the insects will be entering into the flower, it will be eating the pollen grains, having the nectar, but it doesn't bring pollination. So those organisms, we call them as pollen robbers or nectar robbers. So we do find that type of insects also, but this is all the points you need to remember. This can also be asked as a short note. Okay, so short note, write a short note on animal pollination or a short note on wind pollination. So whatever you need to just cover up all this. Okay, so now I told you about insects which bring about pollination. Okay, so insect pollination, there is one term used there. Okay, so entomophagy. entomophily. So insect pollination, so precisely for insect pollination, this is a term which is used, entomophily, or this whole thing, so animals which is bringing about pollination. So this type of pollination we can also call it as zoophily. Okay, so overall zoophily means it is the animal pollination. Okay, and precisely for insect pollination we have used a separate term, that is entomophily. Okay, so with this we come to the end of this part, that is agents of pollination. Okay, so we'll stop at this point. So I want all of you to just know the different points. So I had written few characteristic features of wind pollinated flowers. Okay, so there's no much diagram here. Okay, so 3 types of pollination. Okay, so the 3 names you need to recall, and I've given you some points for wind pollinated flowers. Okay, so those points I want you people to just write. I had written on the board. Okay, so I want you people to write the characteristic feature of wind pollinated flower. So all of you write once, take a pic. Okay, so below the video is a link given, open it and you can post the pic here. Okay, so we'll meet in the next session. Thank you, have a good day.